You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to episode 65 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. Connect with us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or swing by our website, socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Jakob Svensson to the show. He is an associate professor at the School of Arts and Communication at Malmö University in Sweden. And Dr. Svensson is currently working on a project funded by the Swedish Research Council called Behind the Algorithm, a study of programmers, the logics behind their work. And this is interesting and something we touched on in episode 55 of this podcast with Dr. Siva Vaidyanathan, which is there are certain cultures in Silicon Valley, like a kind of left-wing hippie culture. And we need to take that into account when we're thinking about how algorithms on platforms work, because at the end of the day, people are programming these algorithms. And so in a sense, values and ideologies can become literally programmed in algorithms. So from this line of argument, there's a way to think about the logic behind algorithms and how and why they operate. And this is something that Dr. Svensson's work has dealt with at length, is this idea of media logics, and a logic being sort of the rules of the game, how it works. And there's a longstanding literature on mass media logic, so the type of norms and values that drive journalistic reporting. And Dr. Svensson has done some work comparing mass media logics and social media logics. So we're going to start out with those pieces to kind of set the stage before we get into kind of socio-cultural understandings of data and algorithms and artificial intelligence, and quite frankly, go all over the place in this conversation. But first, we start out by talking about two academic articles that Dr. Svensson has written together with Ulrika Klinger. They are both in the Journal of New Media and Society, and the first is called The Emergence of Network Media Logic in Political Communication, a Theoretical Approach. And then there is an updated version that came out in 2018 called The End of Media Logics, on algorithms and agency. So these are really interesting pieces, very conceptual, theoretical pieces, and we dig into them to set the stage for a conversation about how should we be thinking about data, how should we be thinking about algorithms, are they autonomous, are they accountable, or do they not have agency in the same way that humans do? And I think this is a really timely conversation to have, because as we get towards the end of 2018, which I think will come to be remembered as the year of the techlash, because there's been so much controversy, not just around data privacy and Cambridge Analytica, but Twitter and are their algorithms censoring hate speech, or Google and are their algorithms exhibiting racial bias. So we kind of touch on these issues in the episode, and I think it connects very well with our previous episode where we were discussing how do we as academics take a step back and kind of reflect about where we should take our research moving forward. And I think it's important to stop, pause a minute, and conceptualize actually what is data, what are algorithms, and what are the logics that drive them. So we are going to dig into that, and let me cut to that interview. Again, my guest is Dr. Jakob Svensson. He is an associate professor in the School of Arts and Communication at Malmö University. Dr. Svensson, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Well, it's my pleasure.
So I'm curious to get your take. I know you've written a lot on this concept of media logics and network media logics. Can you start out by sort of telling us a bit about what exactly is a media logic?
Well, I mean, I've done this together with Professor Ulrike Klinger at the Freie University of Berlin. She's also affiliated to the Weissenbaum Institute for the Network Society, so we should give her credit, of course. But I mean, we were generally disenchanted with the way political communication were talking about the role of social media, basically, in politics. Because on the one hand, there was this idea that social media would revolutionize everything. It should be totally democratic and participatory, bottom-ups, bringing the voters back in, etc. And then, the pendulums just swung to the other side, and you had Masvarov and the net illusion that basically, and now I'm generalizing heavily, basically saying that social media doesn't change anything. It's just the old social cultural biases. So in other terms, you had on one hand, extreme form of techno-determinism, in the sense that new technology will determine a new type of political communication. But on the other hand, you could also say that these so-called very techno-pessimists were deep social determinists, in a sense, social cultural determinists, that society and culture determine everything. So we wanted to be able to speak about what media actually does to politics and political communication without either resorting to techno-determinism or social cultural determinism, if you so wish. So then we went back to this classical work by Altheide and Snow. They wrote this book in 1979 called Media Logics. And they talk about how media, and they're different domains, but they have one chapter on politics, how media influence politics, in the sense that politicians adapt the way to speak in order to get into the media. And that is, of course, connected to mass media. So for us, going back to this book was a way to find a way to talk about the role of media and politics and political communication without resorting to any of the types of determinisms I just mentioned. So basically, Media Logics is a way to talk about the role of media in politics. And Altheide and Snow has been very clear in their, I even have the quote here on page 15. They say that it's not the case of media dictating the terms of the rest of the society, but an interaction between organized institutional behavior and the media. So sometimes for the people who haven't perhaps only heard about Altheide and Snow and their original work, they think of them as media determinists, that media will determine everything. But that's actually not the case. I just want to point that out, that it's an interaction between the political logics as well, of course. There is, for example, in Sweden, where we have the 4% threshold for getting into the parliament, that's it's actually policy logic, if you're going to follow the distinction that Frank Esser does, but that actually determines the way that media report about politics. So you have the other way around, that media adapts to the logics of the political institutions as well. So it was a way for us to talk about, in this case, social media without being accused of being determined. We were accused of being determinists anyway, but that was not our intention. So yeah.
I guess it gets to this idea of logic being something that is kind of deterministically followed or something. And I want to ask you about that in a second. But first, what I like, and you have this 2015 piece and then a 2018 piece.
Yeah, and there's actually a book chapter in between as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to trace the thought process, because I pointed out some things that I thought were interesting. Yeah. We're going to talk about algorithms and what they bring into the equation. But in the 2015 article, which will be linked to in the show notes, you compare a mass media logic, so the kind of traditional legacy broadcast media, to the logics of social media, and you break it down in terms of production, distribution, and usage. And so not necessarily digging into those concepts at a very granular level, I'll leave that to the readers to read, but what was the idea between comparing mass media and social media versus, let's say, social media and a political logic?
Well, we follow here very closely to Altheide and Snow, so that's why we did this comparison between mass media logic and network media logic. But it's important to point out here that this is for analytical purposes. These neat little categories, etc. Of course, there is always interlinkages between the two, and they intersect in intricate ways, and not the least in 2013 and Andrew Chadwick's work on the hybrid media system. So this needs to be pointed out, that this is for analytical purposes, that we think that in order to see how things blend, we also need to see them as separate entities. So this was the idea behind separate them. And we also wanted to talk about this blending in a bit, and this, which we do in the 2015 articles, the concluding sections, we talk about the blending between mass media and network media logic. So this was the rationale of comparing it to mass media. And then after all, we are media and communication scholars, so compared to you as a political scientist, media matters to us very much, perhaps more than politics in a sense. So maybe this was the reason, yeah.
And one of the things, in reading your piece a bit critically, when you're looking at the network logics, you're basically saying, okay, whereas mass media, it's expensive to produce, you need professional journalists that are, focused on around a particular location, like a national community. The network media logics are cheap to access. Individuals can share the information, across the world. But then I think what the development is, and what you write about in the 2018 piece, is this concept of algorithms as kind of a force that wasn't so popular in 2015, right? And you talk all about algorithms and having agency. So I know this is your big interest right now. Can you talk about, what is the importance of algorithms? Why did you bring those into that 2018 piece? Where are you thinking about it today?
Well, you're perfectly right. With the development towards algorithms, and now perhaps even more, maybe we reached peak algorithm, talk more data. Data is, I went to the ICREA conference earlier this month, and everything was data and datafication. That's a different story. But when all these algorithms and datafication and robot journalism, algorithmic journalism, all of that came in, there were questions about whether media logics would be obsolete, that we don't need to talk about media logics because we have algorithms basically doing the media now, that there are no humans behind the media production, especially for online media or network media. So we looked into these arguments a little bit more closely, and this is what dragged me into the whole algorithms and data and datafication and everything, and saw that this was, of course, I'm providing you with a crude, condensed version of the argument here, but this was where we saw that this is absolutely not the case, that behind all these algorithms and behind all this data are actually people. Because if we look at the way that we talk about media logics, we talk about them in terms of ideals or values, if you wish, commercial imperatives as well as technological affordances. And there are still people behind that. So our argument then in the 2018 article is that the idea that algorithms supersede media logics, or will mean the end of media logics, that is the title of the article, is actually wrong, because before, media logics actually precede the algorithms, because the media logics is influencing the programmers that are actually producing the algorithms. So this is where I became drawn into algorithms and the human side of algorithms, the people behind the algorithms. Who are they? What are their logics, if you so wish, or their values and norms, culture, what goes into the designing of algorithms, and which is very much a big issue today with algorithms failing. We've seen it with the face recognition algorithms. We've seen it with Cambridge Analytica, etc. So I think we were right on time in that sense, that we actually pointed towards, even though algorithm has started to fail already when we started to write this article, which, by the way, was way before 2018, but you know how the publishing industry works, yeah? So this was how we became drawn into algorithms and datafication, yeah.
And I want to stick on this this topic and kind of pick apart some of the things that you mentioned, because algorithms is such a buzzword, timely topic where everyone's talking about. And one of the points you make is that algorithms are not neutral. And I think you hinted to that before, but can you sort of unpack that argument? Why are algorithms not neutral?
Well, the easy answer to that would be that algorithms are designed by humans. That would be the short answers, and humans are not neutral. And now you could even add to that argument that algorithms, I think there are two sides of the coin. I mean, you have algorithms and you have data, because algorithms is just a method. It's a calculation. It's Tanja Buscher in Copenhagen wrote this book, If Then. If you have this, then this. No, so it's a calculation. It's a formula. I think recipe is often used as a metaphor for algorithm. Now, that in itself has to be set up by someone. Of course, there are now machine learning, deep learning, etc. But from the beginning, there has to be some kind of designing element by some humans. And there has to be some kind of problem. For example, I'm studying a news ranking algorithm now in a newspaper. So what's the problem? They want to make profit or have automation, so they can have their people doing more journalistic stuff, and the algorithms can push up and down things on the first page on the news portal site. So that's one thing. There is a problem which is based in the social cultural world of problems, and if we look at social media, there are enterprises that are there to make money. So they want to make money. Yeah. So there is a problem making money, automation or whatever, which is in itself based in our case a capitalistic society. So they are biased by the society, and then you have the programmers that are biased because of their culture. I mean, I'm doing interviews with programmers now. Lovely people, I love them, so nothing bad about them. But they have a culture. They come from a hacker society, also kind of a more hippie. I mean, if you look at the whole East Coast versus the West Coast in the US, how people migrated from the New York area to Silicon Valley, and how the whole hippie idea. So there is a whole cultural element that also mix into the ethics and cultures and the norms and values of programmers. And then thirdly, and you have to stop me if I talk too much, because this is a problem with academics.
Keep going.
And thirdly, data, because this is what I'm interested in very now. Data in itself is biased. Data etymologically comes from the Latin word datum, what is given. We have it in the date. In today's date, is November something, yeah? So we think of data as something, what is given, beyond picking apart, something neutral, objective fact, but it's not. Data in itself is deeply cultural, and there is a book from 2013, which is called, it's an edited volume by Lisa Gittelman, which is called Raw Data is an Oxymoron, which is a wonderful collection of pieces that actually shows how data, how it's collected, how it's extracted, embeds cultural norms and values. So there are many different ways that algorithms are biased. And the thing that they calculate on, the data, is biased. The actual formulas, the algorithm in itself has been designed by humans. And they're not designing out of the blue. I mean, some are, of course. I mean, there are hackers that like to do things just because of fun of it. But mostly algorithms are based on real world problems that someone thinks needs solving. And so they are framed social culturally.
It's interesting because I want to, I think you put it really, really well in the text, which is you say that ideology is inscribed in code.
Yeah.
I just love that phrase. And I want to ask because, especially in the United States, there's been such a controversy around, are algorithms biasing conservative content, for example? And as you were talking about this sort of hippie culture and the hacker way, we've talked about that a bit on the podcast before. If the algorithms are programmed by people who are presumed to be very leftist, why do we have a conservative president in the States? Or is there what is that bias actually doing to society, do you think?
Well, in terms of political leanings, I mean, there was this, I think it was 2014, correct me if I'm wrong here, 2015, when you had the Mike Brown shooting. And at the same time, you had the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. And there you had, Facebook was all about the Ice Bucket Challenge, whereas the Twitter was all about the Mike Brown killing. So there was this idea of a bias there. Now, I think that we need to look at these algorithms not so much in this sense, in terms of who programs them, but in terms of that they are programmed for companies, Facebook and Twitter, that are commercial companies that want to make money. So they are biased towards, the type of data mining, data gathering that these companies needs in order to be able to target advertising or selling data to third parties, etc. And this is what we see that where Facebook is prioritizing trending, whereas Twitter was prioritizing breaking at the time, where you got this different result. But this is not because of the leanings of the programmers, but because of the problem that was posed onto the programmers by the companies who want to get the most out of the data they can collect in order to make money. Where we can more closely see the biases of the programmers in algorithms is, for example, when we have face recognition algorithms suggesting that Black people are gorillas, for example. It's a famous example from a couple of years ago. Or we have, Google search algorithm that actually is even more gender biased than society in general when it comes to women CEOs, if you do a search on that, which was also an example on that. So there we can see that the underrepresentation of women and people of different ethnic background. I mean, there are some ethnic backgrounds that are more represented in the Silicon Valley than others, but some are not. There you can see it. And this is, and I want to stress here, this is not because these programmers are evil types. It's just because, similarity attracts. You test on what you have. And this is what will happen. And then we have another thing I wanted to say also, which is, I think, underlooked at right now. And that is, we talk a lot about bias in algorithms in terms of gender and ethnicity. But there is also an age bias that is not talked about at all. I mean, the programmers are most of them of a certain age. And there are studies coming out from Barcelona now suggesting how algorithms also bias in terms of age. So I think it's easier to see in these type of domains than in the political leanings of the programmers.
And I have a specific question about bias along the lines that we were just talking about. But first, I want to kind of set the ground with this idea of the agency or non-agency of algorithms, because I've freshly read your piece. Basically, you sort of look at what is agency, and you have these three criteria.
Which is a hugely controversial question. I mean, we don't have everyone who agrees with us there, by the way. Yeah.
Do you want to recap that kind of argument of like how you interpret human agency and then what that missing element is that algorithms don't have?
So when we talk about agency, we're basing this on an article by Emir Bayer and Mish from 1998, which defines agency in terms, it is a temporal definition of agency in terms of iteration, projections, and practical evaluations. And so basically, you can have agency in terms of looking at the past and acting upon that, and then to project the future. And then you can have also agency in kind of adapting to the messiness of the present. And what we argue here is that, at least now, that algorithms, we could argue that they have agency in terms of, I mean, we know that mining past behavior or mining past data traces in order to make predictions of the future. But where algorithms perhaps fail is in the messiness of the presence. For example, the image search algorithm that projected Black people as gorillas, they could not handle or be reflective of that this would be considered racist. So they could not handle the messiness of the present. So this is where we argue that algorithmic agency is not on par with human agency, at least not where we stand now. And the more I've been studying this now in my current project on artificial intelligence and datafication, I think it's unlikely that algorithms actually will be able to handle this. And we can also raise questions about the projections, I mean, the future predictions that algorithms makes, because they're mining data traces, which is our past behavior, in order to predict the future. And if there is something we know, is that the future is not the past. So there are some problems there, I think, in the projectability.
I'm glad you bring up the Google example, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. So in the piece, you have, and I hate to keep using these sort of racist examples, but that's where we are. You mentioned where if you type in 3 white children or 3 white boys,
teenagers,
three white teenagers, you'll get a picture, like stock photos that you could buy, use for whatever purpose. Whereas if you type 3 Black teenagers, you get a lot of mugshots. And this was a controversial example. And I was thinking, if the difference between human agency and algorithmic agency is the lack of algorithms to reflect and recognize this is racist, is that a failure of the algorithm, or is that a reflection of society, right? Because these are only as good as the input data and the way they're trained to code. So is it that the algorithms aren't reflective, or that they're reflecting maybe a hidden truth that we may not want to confront?
Well, this important question you raised, but I think training data, which is an extremely interesting term in itself, but the data that algorithms are trained on can be very biased, which often is the case when we see image recognition algorithms, because they have not been trained on people of different color than white. And this goes back to a history of racism in photography in general, because I mean, when you do photography, you always calibrate for the white, and that's so in a sense, photography is from its history, it's racist, you could say. So the data that is trained upon needs to be, reflective of society as a whole. Otherwise, it will be biased, as is the case of when it comes to gender representation, where some of the algorithms actually perform worse than the reality, so to speak. But then you're perfectly right that we live in a society that is not perfect in any sense. Yeah? And you could argue that this is because of the society. And this is what, when the example you said from Google, they said that no, they actually blamed the algorithm. Google's not racist, it's the algorithm. Or you could also say with the infamous example of Microsoft chatbot Tay, which was allegedly hacked by Anonymous, but they were saying like, no, it's because Twitter is such a horrible place from the beginning with a lot of these inflammatory, polarizing kind of language. So it's just reflecting, Tay was just reflecting the reality. Now, for me, that's a bit easy to get off the hook, I think. I think you need to, I must say that I like technology. I think we can do great things with technology, but I also think that we have a responsibility to actually actively work against these type of biases. And when Google said that in terms of the free black teenagers and free white teenagers, that the algorithm is biased, it's not Google. It's actually not true, because what Google wants to do is they want to connect buyers and sellers of stock photography. And most of these buyers are in the US and the UK. And a majority of the population in the US and in the UK are white, and they tend to buy pictures of similar people. Similarity attracts. It's a psychological principle. So, in the sense, no, Google is not racist in that sense. Google wants to make money. So this is why their algorithm prioritize when they see free white teenagers think like, oh, someone wants to buy a photo, and this is what they want to connect sellers and buyers of this photography. Whereas there tends not to be this type of transaction when it comes to people of color. So that means that they will get a different result. Because this is an algorithm that is forged in a capitalistic system, in a capitalistic company who wants to make money. In a sense, they didn't want to be racist, but to say that the algorithm is racist, no, it's to say that this society that we live in is actually racist in that sense, because there is still structural differences between certain segments of the population. And of course, when they found this out, this was not intended, it was an unintended consequences. Google doesn't want to have this upon their brand that they are racist. They, of course, went to correct that, and they're quick to do that. But the fact that the algorithm couldn't detect that or couldn't reflect upon that in the first place, we argue is a sign of they're not full agency yet then, in terms of the practical evaluations using from mere buyer and niche delineation.
And so I want to move in a bit to this artificial intelligence realm that you've been working on. I don't know if algorithms fit into this in the sense that, I guess first, can algorithms, in terms of thinking about solutions, can they be programmed to reflect, do you think, and have this sort of intelligence that we ascribe to humans? It's totally looking into the crystal ball question.
I'm a social scientist. Well, why not? I think there is a lot of fear about technology, and there is a lot of fear about technology taking over. There's a lot of fear about the singularity. That robots will take over and humans will become obsolete, etc. But I think instead of being afraid of technology and algorithms and being afraid of technology driving us, which it does to a certain extent today. I was totally driven by my phone walking here today because I was looking at the Google Map. But anyway, we should actually be in control of technology to make technology do what we want it to do and not the other way around. So we should take control. We should not only be consumers of technology, we should also be writers of technology and producers of technology. So I think that the question that you ask is, I don't know, but we should definitely strive for it. Technology can be used for wonderful things. And we should use technology for wonderful things, and we should not be afraid of technology. And I do not think that technology will take over. We still are the masters of technology.
So can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing on artificial intelligence and kind of how you're thinking about it right now?
Well, yeah. So I come to artificial intelligence from data. So I've been very interested in this datafication and dataism. And so I'm recently started thinking about whether there is some kind of data essentialism, and there's a lot of isms here. I'm sorry for that. But basically, because I seem to see that around me now, that there is this idea of data being the essence of basically everything. And we have Yuval Noah Harari's best-selling book on Homo Deus, where he basically makes this argument, that both humans and computers basically consist of data flows, which then means that we could merge life and data sciences. And then he goes on and makes the argument that then Homo sapiens are on the brink of evolving into a new species, that would be Homo Deus, or perhaps, I argue, we should call it Homo Datus. But this, I think, can be questioned in many, many different ways. And I think data and algorithm are the basis of artificial intelligence here. First of all, I mean, when people talk about data here in this sense, if you look at some of the authors, including Harari, they never define data. And this lack of definition also makes it kind of mythical in the sense. It gets these properties that it can do all types of different things. And also because it's then treated as objective and neutral. And we are kind of touching upon that in our 2018 article, this idea of algorithms and data being neutral. But it's really not, as we've been talking about before. And if you look at definitions of data, and there is this idea that data is actually social-cultural. I mean, it's made of, as I talked about this volume by Gittelman, raw data is an oxymoron, that data it has a lot of biases in itself. And there actually we should talk about what is captured, datum, like what is given, instead we talk about what is taken, so capta instead of captum from Latin. So if we start to think about what data is, and this is surprisingly uncontroversial, the idea that data is social-cultural, and there is even a field called critical data studies. But if we take away the neutrality and objectivity of data and admit that it's social-cultural, then, we have to start the questions whether the premises upon which artificial intelligence is built would also start unraveling. Because if we agree that data is a human construct from the beginning, or it's some kind of information put into a form of ones and zeros, how could everything in the universe be described as data? Can it really capture everything? Unless you're in extreme form of social constructivist, that is, when everything is social constructions. So it's from these points of view I start to ask whether AI is really can do all the things that we suppose it can do. And then from another perspective, we have to look at intelligence. The I word of AI. What is intelligence? And there is this ideas that there are two sides of intelligence. The more rational side, but then there is also the more irrational, random, emotional side of intelligence, which is not so easily captured in algorithms, because algorithms are about computing and mathematical language in that sense. So intelligence has many more dimensions than the pure numerical or calculable. So this is also where I ask whether, if we think about artificial intelligence as replacing human intelligence or not, then I think maybe this is an oxymoron in the sense that maybe it's not true. But then, once again, I don't want to come across as a total techno-pessimist. I think there is things that artificial intelligence, if we limit artificial intelligence to what they can do, is excellent. They have these kind of vertical abilities, calculating, going through large types of material, connecting donors and patients of organs, for example, has proven to be very good at that. So I think we should, instead of focusing so much on artificial intelligence taking over, we should think about what can artificial intelligence do, what are artificial intelligence good at, and what are human intelligence good at, and see how these things can work together in order to solve these kind of deep problems that we are facing with climate change and polarization and other things.
Right. Yeah. Because I wanted to ask, I mean, this is a very, this critical media studies, critical data studies. It's interesting from the social and cultural angle, but I want to bring it sort of down and drill into what does this mean for politics at the formal level, in terms of development of algorithms, intelligence, AI. I mean, like, what implications does that have for political processes in the context of elections or in political news consumption, for example? I mean, we talk a lot about AI and smart speakers and stuff like that. I mean, does that have implications for, you mentioned polarization, climate change? I mean, where does that fit into the political realm?
Well, I mean, if you look at some of the more pessimistic dystopian pictures that are put out there, I mean, AI in its worst kind of development would make politics completely obsolete. I mean, you wouldn't even need politics or politicians or democracy for that matter, because you would totally be able to predict humans anyway, so it would be completely useless to have politics and elections and these things. So I think that in this type of data essentialistic manner, AI is a threat to politics and politicians, because it would make them completely obsolete in a sense. But so I think it's very important that we actually start to raise this critical question and also start to underline the aspects of humanity that I think cannot be captured in technology or in data, such as the emotional, the randomness, etc., because that would also make it possible for a discussion where it's possible to actually change your mind and listen to each other happen. Because if we're completely predictable, well, then there is no need of politics. Politics, in a sense, builds upon the premise that you could actually have a discussion and persuade someone to change their mind.
I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think of how you operationalize that. And I mean, to some extent, to a very small extent, I mean, I think you see that happening in today's communication. Like, you can sort of predict that if you want to get a lot of likes on Instagram, you should post this type of content at this hour of the day. And so those sorts of protocols shape how we communicate, I think, more than maybe we realize.
But I mean, if I'm just allowed to jump in here, I mean, I think also that if you look at political opinions and the way that people consume political news online, there seems to be tendency to I mean, this confirmation bias. You only tend to absorb the kind of opinions that you already have, etc. So this would also mean, and perhaps this is a positive thing for politics, that a lot, not all, but a lot of political opinion making or making up a political mind happens in other spheres than in the media, which makes politics perhaps fundamentally unhackable.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm just thinking about this idea of, as you're saying, these programmers with a certain set of ideologies and logics, as we were talking about, they program these tools that I think in the early days with the cyber optimism, it would be this forum for democratic deliberation. But I think increasingly people are very careful in curating how they communicate and how, even with Trump tweets, right? Yeah. There's a certain curation element to that. And I'm just wondering how that, where that's all going, and whether that is actually a good thing for politics or a bad one, because things are becoming more calculated, right? Politicians are deciding. We were talking in this podcast series earlier about Trump deciding where to hold his rallies during the campaign based on a city's algorithm that was built by Cambridge Analytica. So is that predictability good? Is it part of politics? Should we embed that into the political process today? Or is it taking away from the fundamental randomness that you were talking about, that politicians sometimes had to innovate?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a double-edged sword in the sense that on the one hand, I think that Trump has been extremely successful in playing the media, because if you look at Swedish politics, for example, they're extremely media trained to the point that people find them so utterly boring and predictable and boring to look at, because they know exactly how to play the media, which makes them, in a sense, unhuman, where I think that Donald Trump comes across as extremely human in that sense. And it seems like his electoral base is extremely forgiving of him as well because of that. So I think media can be played in both ways, both in the sense that in order for people to be more, genuine or authentic, as I think that people who support Trump conceive of him, as well as being so much afraid of media and your media image, if you look at the other side of the coin, which is Swedish politician, makes them into some kind of media robots that has no connection to the electorates. But that's me speculating, etc. Yeah.
Oh man, we are all over the place with this
place.
conversation, but as is apt to happen when two academics get together. Dr. Svensson, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Jakob Svensson, Associate Professor in the School of Arts and Communication at Malmö University. You can find the studies we talked about in this episode down in the episode description. And that'll do it for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Keep up with all the latest news regarding the show by following us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or signing up to the newsletter at socialmediaandpolitics.org. And I do have an exciting project coming out ahead of the European Parliament election, so stay tuned for that. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.